The sound of splintering wood echoed through the valley as Police Commissioner James Harlow's phone vibrated in his pocket. He was in the middle of a budget meeting when the text from his neighbor came through. Asterisk emergency at your cabin. Someone's tearing it down. Not a joke, asterisk. James stared at his phone, momentarily frozen. The cabin had been in his family for 3 generations, a hand-built testament to his grandfather's craftsmanship nestled in the pines of Blackwater Ridge. The property had been valued at $850,000 in last year's assessment, but to James, it was priceless. A sanctuary where his children had learned to fish, where his father had taught him to split wood, where family traditions were as deeply rooted as the ancient pines surrounding it. Commissioner Harlow, the budget director's voice pulled him back. Your thoughts on the new patrol vehicle allocation? Meeting adjourned, James said, rising from his chair. The authority in his voice left no room for questions as the other department heads exchanged confused glances. Family emergency. 90 minutes later, James's SUV skidded to a halt on the gravel road leading to his property. What he saw made his blood run cold. A yellow excavator was parked where his front porch should have been. Half of the cabin lay in ruins, century-old timber reduced to splinters and rubble. A woman in a crisp white blouse and designer jeans stood by the machine, clipboard in hand, directing a crew of workers. She looked completely out of place in the rugged mountain setting, like a corporate executive who had wandered into the wilderness by mistake. Stop, James roared, his commanding voice carrying across the clearing. 20 years in law enforcement had taught him how to make people freeze with a single word. The woman turned, eyebrows raised slightly, more annoyed than alarmed. Can I help you? What the hell do you think you're doing? James stormed toward her, badge instinctively in hand, though he was off duty. This is private property. My property. The woman adjusted her designer sunglasses, looking entirely unimpressed. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Victoria Reeves, and this is my development project. We have all the proper permits. She held up her clipboard with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I don't care if you have permits signed by God himself. This cabin has been in my family for 70 years. There's no way anyone authorized its demolition. Victoria's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through documents. This is plot 157B of the Blackwater Ridge properties. We purchased it 6 months ago. This is plot 158B, James corrected, his voice dangerously quiet. It's never been for sale. The color drained from Victoria's face as she double-checked her documents. James could pinpoint the exact moment realization dawned on her, the widening eyes, the parted lips, the sudden rigid posture. She had made a catastrophic error. There must be some mistake in the surveyor's report, she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. We were very thorough with the paperwork. Not thorough enough. James surveyed the destruction of his family legacy. The hand-carved staircase his grandfather had crafted now splintered and crushed, the riverstone fireplace partially collapsed, the generations of memories buried in the rubble. Half the structure still stood, but the damage was devastating. Victoria's eyes darted to the badge still in James' hand, then back to his face. We can fix this. I'm sure my company's insurance will cover. Do you have any idea what you've done? James cut her off, his voice quiet but trembling with rage. This isn't about money. Sir, I understand you're upset, but I'm not just sir, James said, tucking his badge back into his pocket. I'm Police Commissioner James Harlow, and you've just destroyed something irreplaceable. Victoria's face went from pale to ashen. She had just demolished the family cabin of the most powerful law enforcement official in the county. And James was only getting started. Victoria Reeves had built her reputation on never making mistakes. As the youngest executive at Pinnacle Development Group, she clawed her way to success through meticulous attention to detail and ruthless efficiency. Her colleagues called her the bulldozer behind her back, not just for her aggressive business tactics, but for her ability to flatten any obstacle in her path. Now, standing before the half-demolished cabin with the police commissioner's eyes boring into her, Victoria realized she had become the obstacle in her own path. I don't want to see every permit, every document, every email related to this project, James demanded, his phone already out as he snapped photos of the destruction. And I want your demolition crew off my property. Now. The workers needed no further encouragement. They'd overheard enough to understand the gravity of the situation, gathering their tools and retreating to their trucks with remarkable speed. The excavator operator jumped down from his machine, keys in hand, looking like he wanted to disappear into the forest. Victoria maintained her professional demeanor through sheer force of will, though internally she was calculating the damage to the property, to her career, to Pinnacle's reputation. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a potential lawsuit that could bankrupt her company. Commissioner Harlow, she began, adopting the conciliatory tone she reserved for difficult clients. I take full responsibility for this error. Pinnacle Development will cover all costs for rebuilding your cabin exactly as it was. James laughed, but there was no humor in it. Exactly as it was? This cabin was built with old-growth timber that doesn't exist anymore. The furniture inside, his voice caught, my great-grandmother's rocking chair, my father's carved chess set, the cradle that held 4 generations of my family. Those aren't things you can replace with a checkbook. Victoria swallowed hard, finally grasping the magnitude of what had been lost. This wasn't a simple property dispute. This was someone's heritage reduced to splinters because of her company's carelessness. I understand, she said quietly, though she didn't, possibly. But I promise you, we will make this right. You can start by showing me exactly how this happened, James said, gesturing toward her clipboard. Victoria led him to her Range Rover, spreading maps and documents across the hood. The property was part of a package we acquired for the Blackwater Ridge Luxury Retreat. According to our surveyor, she trailed off, scanning the documents with growing horror. There it was, a clear discrepancy between the county records and their project plans. A simple transposition of numbers that no one had caught. Your surveyor should be fired, James said flatly. I signed off on these plans myself, Victoria admitted. Professional suicide, perhaps, but in that moment, honesty seemed the only path forward. James studied her for a long moment. At least you have the decency to admit it. A silver SUV came bouncing up the road, parking behind James' vehicle. A man in his 50s stepped out, his weathered face creasing with shock as he took in the scene. Mike, James nodded to his neighbor. Thanks for the text. Jesus, Jim. I tried to stop them when I saw what was happening, but the lady said she had permits. Mike shook his head, surveying the damage. Your dad would have had a heart attack seeing this. The comment landed like a physical blow. James turned away, his shoulders tight with grief and anger. Victoria watched the interaction with growing unease. The human cost of her error was becoming clearer by the minute. This wasn't just about liability or insurance claims. This was about a family's history being erased through corporate negligence. Her negligence. Commissioner, she said, her usual confidence nowhere to be found, I know this is inadequate, but I am truly sorry. James turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Sorry doesn't rebuild my cabin, but action might. He pulled out his phone again. I'm calling my attorney, and then I'm calling yours. Victoria nodded, accepting the inevitable legal storm. But as James stepped away to make his calls, she made one of her own, to her boss, Pinnacle's CEO. The conversation was brief and devastating. You're on your own with this, Victoria, the CEO said coldly. The company can't afford this kind of liability. If a commissioner decides to pursue criminal charges for destruction of property, that's your problem. We'll be issuing a statement distancing Pinnacle from your actions by morning. She stood frozen as the call ended, suddenly understanding just how alone she was. The company she'd sacrificed everything for had thrown her under the bus in less than 5. The days following the demolition unfolded in a blur of legal meetings and uncomfortable revelations. James discovered that Victoria Reeves had been more than just Pinnacle Development's rising star. She'd been their scapegoat in waiting. They're claiming you exceeded your authority, James' attorney explained during a meeting in his downtown office. According to their statement, you were only authorized to scout the location, not approve demolition. Victoria sat across the conference table, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless nights. That's a lie, she said flatly. I have emails from the CEO approving the entire project timeline, including demolition dates. Which you'll provide to us, James said. It wasn't a question. Victoria nodded. I already sent everything to your attorney. I'm not protecting Pinnacle anymore. What had begun as a simple property dispute was rapidly evolving into something more complex. James had expected corporate stonewalling, expected Victoria to hide behind Pinnacle's legal team. Instead, she turned whistleblower, exposing a pattern of corner-cutting and environmental violations that extended far beyond his cabin. They've been falsifying environmental impact reports for years, Victoria explained, sliding a flash drive across the table. There's a reason they acquired that land package so cheaply. The previous owner discovered toxic runoff from an old mining operation on parts of the property. Pinnacle buried the report and moved forward anyway. James studied her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because what happened to your cabin wasn't just a mistake. It was the result of a corporate culture that prioritizes profit over people and proper procedure. Victoria met his gaze steadily, and because I was part of that culture, I didn't ask enough questions. I trusted reports I should have verified personally. The admission costs were visibly, pride crumbling like the cabin's walls had. Later that afternoon, James stood in the ruins of his family's legacy, watching as Victoria walked the perimeter with a contractor she hired independently. They spoke in low tones, the contractor making notes and occasionally shaking his head. Commissioner, Victoria approached, looking oddly determined for someone whose career was imploding. I've been consulting with historical restoration experts. The eastern portion of the cabin is salvageable. The foundation is intact and about 40% of the original structure can be preserved. James raised an eyebrow, and the other 60% can be rebuilt using reclaimed materials from structures of the same era. It won't be identical, but it will be authentic. She hesitated. I've also been in contact with several artisans who specialize in reproducing period furniture. Nothing can replace your family heirlooms, but how are you paying for this? James interrupted. Pinnacles hung you out to dry and restoration costs will exceed the property's market value. Victoria straightened. I'm liquidating my assets. My downtown condo, my investment portfolio. It should cover most of the restoration. James stared at her, genuinely surprised. You're bankrupting yourself over this? I'm taking responsibility, she corrected. Something my former employers should learn to do. The contractor approached with preliminary estimates. As Victoria reviewed them, James stepped away to take a call from his deputy chief about the investigation into Pinnacle's practices. The picture emerging wasn't pretty. The company had a history of skirting regulations and silencing complaints with aggressive legal tactics. When he rejoined Victoria, she was sitting on what remained of the cabin's front steps, staring out at the lake that had drawn his grandfather to build here in the first place. My father taught me to fish from that dock, James said, surprising himself by sharing the memory. Built it himself after the original washed away in a storm. Spent every weekend for a month on it. Wouldn't let anyone help him. Victoria looked up. We'll rebuild that too. Why are you doing this? Really? James asked, sitting beside her on the steps. You could fight this in court, drag it out for years. Most corporate executives would. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. My grandfather was a carpenter, she finally said. Built homes his whole life. He used to say you can tell everything about a person by how they fix their mistakes. She gazed out at the water. I spent my career tearing things down to build luxury properties nobody needs. I think it's time I built something that matters. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water gold and crimson. Neither spoke for several minutes, the silence broken only by the call of a loon across the water. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold as the cabin slowly took shape again. What had begun as a disaster had evolved into something unexpected, a restoration that honored the past while creating something new. The original support beams were hand-hewn pine, Victoria explained to James one crisp October morning, steam rising from their coffee mugs as they reviewed the progress. We found a barn being dismantled in Vermont, same era, same techniques. The restoration team is incorporating those beams into the new structure. James nodded, studying the skeleton of his family's cabin. The familiar bones were there, but Victoria and her team of historical restoration experts had suggested modifications that would preserve the cabin's character, while subtly strengthening its resilience against the harsh mountain winters. My grandfather would have approved, he admitted, surprising himself. He was always tinkering, improving. In the 7 weeks since the demolition, an unlikely partnership had formed from the wreckage. Victoria arrived at the site every morning before dawn and left after sunset, working alongside the craftspeople she assembled. James, initially skeptical, found himself drawn to the property on his days off, watching the restoration with a mix of grief and hope. Their conversations, at first strictly limited to the reconstruction, had gradually expanded. James shared stories of childhood summers spent at the cabin. Victoria talked about her grandfather, the carpenter whose principles she'd lost sight of in her corporate climb. The district attorney wants to meet with you again, James said, breaking a comfortable silence as they watched the restoration team fitting windows salvaged from a 1920s lodge. They're building their case against Pinnacle's executives. Victoria tensed slightly. The investigation had gathered momentum with environmental agencies and state prosecutors circling Pinnacle development like wolves. Her testimony had been central to the case, her meticulous documentation providing a roadmap of corporate malfeasance. Of course, she nodded. Whatever they need. You know they're still considering charges against you, James said carefully. Reduced given your cooperation, but still possible. Victoria's gaze remained fixed on the cabin. I know. The legal sword hanging over her head hadn't deterred her efforts. If anything, it seemed to fuel her determination. She'd sold her condo and liquidated most of her investments, pouring everything into the restoration. The high-end executive who had arrived in designer clothes now wore work boots and flannel, her hands calloused from occasional work alongside the craftsmen she couldn't afford to hire in greater numbers. Have dinner with me tonight, James said suddenly. Victoria turned to him, surprise evident on her face. What? Dinner. At the Riverside Lodge. They do a good steak. He seemed almost embarrassed by the invitation. To discuss the case, of course. And the restoration. Of course, Victoria echoed, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. To discuss the case. Later that evening, seated by a window overlooking the river, their conversation drifted far from legal proceedings or construction details. James talked about his late wife, how the cabin had become both sanctuary and monument after her passing. Victoria spoke of her childhood in her grandfather's workshop and the corporate ambition that had gradually eroded her principles. "I keep wondering who I'd be if I'd stayed true to what he taught me," she admitted, a candlelight catching the regret in her eyes. "We all compromise," James said. "The question is whether we find our way back." As they walked to their cars afterward, the autumn night crisp around them, James hesitated. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said finally. "The charges." Victoria stiffened. "I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences. I've spoken with the DA," he interrupted. "Given your cooperation and the restitution you've made, they're considering dropping the charges against you personally." Victoria stared at him, conflicting emotions crossing her face. "Did you request that?" "I pointed out that justice comes in many forms," James said carefully. "Sometimes it's punishment. Sometimes it's restoration." "I don't want special treatment," Victoria said, her voice quiet but firm. "Especially not from you." "It's not special treatment. It's recognizing that you've already sentenced yourself to a punishment more severe than any court would impose." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains where her life savings were being transformed into his restored heritage. "You've lost your career, your savings, your reputation, and gained something else," Victoria said softly. The moment stretched between them, full of things neither was quite ready to name. The first snow of winter dusted Blackwater Ridge as Victoria stood at the edge of the property, watching smoke curl from the cabin's newly rebuilt chimney. After months of setbacks, financial strain, and backbreaking work, the restoration was complete just in time for Christmas. "It's not exactly the same," she murmured as James joined her, his breath visible in the cold December air. "No," he agreed, studying the cabin that had risen from the ruins. "It's better." The truth of his words surprised them both. The restored cabin honored his grandfather's original vision while incorporating subtle improvements: better insulation, reinforced foundations, updated wiring hidden behind period-appropriate fixtures, modern strength masked by traditional craftsmanship. Much like the relationship that had developed between them. "Your children arrive tomorrow?" Victoria asked, her voice carefully neutral. James nodded. His 3 adult children had reacted with varying degrees of skepticism when he'd explained his evolving relationship with the woman who demolished their childhood sanctuary. His eldest daughter had flatly refused to come for Christmas. His son had agreed but warned he was reserving judgment. Only his youngest, always her father's ally, had expressed cautious optimism. "They'll come around," James said, though uncertainty tinged his words. "Once they see what you've done here. What we've done." Victoria nodded but said nothing. The "we" wasn't lost on her. How the project had transformed from her desperate atonement into their shared creation. She checked her watch. "I should go. Let you prepare for their arrival." "Stay," James said simply. She looked up at him, startled. "What?" "Stay for Christmas. Help me welcome them." Victoria shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "They don't want me here, James. I'm the villain in this story, the corporate shark who destroyed their heritage." "Were," James corrected, past tense, and stories change. Before Victoria could respond, a vehicle pulled up the newly graveled driveway, the district attorney's car. Both turned in surprise. The investigation into Pinnacle Development had resulted in multiple indictments against senior executives, including the CEO. Victoria's testimony had been crucial, but her own legal status had remained in limbo. Ms. Reeves, the DA, greeted her, glancing curiously between her and James. "Commissioner Harlow, I thought I might find you both here." District Attorney Collins, James nodded. "What brings you out to the Ridge?" "Paperwork that seemed worth delivering in person," Collins replied, pulling a document from his briefcase. "Given the season." He handed the document to Victoria, who opened it with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the text, widening as she absorbed its meaning. "They dropped all charges," she said softly, looking up at James, "in exchange for my testimony at the upcoming trials." James maintained a carefully neutral expression. "That seems appropriate, given your cooperation." The DA's gaze moved between them again, a knowing look that suggested he wasn't fooled by their professional facades. "The restoration looks remarkable," he commented. "Like it was never destroyed." "Not exactly," Victoria said. "We kept some of the original scars, incorporated them into the new design." "Fitting," the DA nodded. "Well, I won't intrude on your holiday preparations further. Merry Christmas to you both." After he departed, Victoria stood silently, still holding the document that granted her legal freedom, if not financial solvency. The restoration had consumed her life savings and then some. She'd taken odd consulting jobs to cover the final costs, living in a rented room above the local hardware store whose owner had taken pity on her transformation from corporate executive to local redemption story. "I've been thinking," James said as they walked back toward the cabin. The department is looking for a community liaison, someone to oversee our property management and community projects. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job, Commissioner? The cabin isn't the only thing in the county that needs restoration, he said carefully. There's a historical downtown district that's been neglected, parks that need revitalization. You've proven you have the skills. You can't hire me because you feel sorry for me, Victoria said firmly, or because of whatever this is between us. I'm not. The position reports to the city manager, not me. All I can do is recommend you, which I have. He smiled slightly. Though I did recuse myself from the final decision due to personal involvement. Victoria stopped at the porch steps, taking in the cabin that had become the unexpected center of her redemption journey. The hand-carved porch railings, the river stone chimney, the front door salvaged from a historical building and restored to match James' childhood memories.